Okay, so we left off having talked about the evolutionary origins and the theological significance of altruism, of self-relinquishing love. I do want to comment, part just in response to some of the questions that are asked. The purpose of this exercise isn't so much to reduce these great human imponderables to science, but it is twofold. First of all, many of them have constituted challenges for scientific explanation. And so that's a fascinating mystery story. Scientists are always wanting to see if they can explain what appears to be inexplicable. But secondly, I think science, when rightly done, can serve as a meditation tool for us on the imponderables. They can cast light on aspects of these wondrous aspects of being that we might not have thought about before. So what I want to do with you this afternoon is reflect on the theological context of the altruism question and use that as a springboard into discussing theories of religion. And in particular, the sciences look at religion in a number of different ways. There are psychological and sociological and neuroscientific approaches to religious belief and experience, but I want to look specifically at evolutionary proposals. So, picking up where we left off, how about some integrative comments about where we just came from? First of all, these notions of differing explanations for altruism and evolutionary theory, and they're really conflicting explanations, by the way, and in many times embittered conflicts. So some of the proponents of individual selection, let's see, can I name names? Well, one primary proponent of individual selection has indicated that he believes David Wilson, a major proponent of group selection, has, quote unquote, thrown away his career and done more to injure evolutionary theory than the anti-evolutionists themselves. So these are highly contested issues, and I want to suggest that the tensions in evolutionary approaches actually mirror tensions that have historically been involved in theological reflection on the nature of love. And in particular, it's a tension between what we might call natural goodness versus the need for radical transformation. There's a lot of language that we can use, a lot of traditions that embody this tradition. For example, Stephen Pope has a book, Evolutionary Altruism in the Ordering of Love. It reflects the Catholic commitment to the ladder, the expanding scale of loves, starting with self-love and love of family and love of neighbor, extending to altruism. But on the other hand, there's another tradition that argues the ladder is not long enough to get us there. It's a radical agapeist tradition as promoted by Niels Nygren, for example. It reflects tensions between, on the one hand, Augustinian, on the other hand, Thomistic views, or Wesleyan views versus Reformed views. In fact, not just in the Christian tradition, but more generally, and I mentioned this before, in a number of religious traditions, there's a tension between the way of negation and the way of affirmation. And these tensions are very much alive in evolutionary theory as well. So on the one hand, you have the kin selection approach and the group selection approach that says it's in us. Natural cooperativity is in us, although it's constrained. And then on the other hand, you have the mimetic tradition that says, but ultimately it's not in us, and we need a radical reformulation. Now, the interesting thing is that up till now, these tensions have not been reconciled in scientific theory. And here's where theology, I think, may be a little bit ahead of the natural sciences. Theology has dealt with these tensions for centuries, and there are some theological proposals, mediating proposals. For example, the Thomistic notion of grace-fulfilling nature, not obliterating, but nature alone isn't sufficient. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Four Loves, has a wonderful last chapter on agape, where he argues that the natural loves are not ultimately self-serving, they're not ultimately bad, but they are ultimately frail and in need of redemption by agape love, by altruism, that left to their own devices, they will in fact not endure and probably will become self-serving, that they, again, grace fulfilling nature. So I want to see if I can explore a scientifically integrative and theologically hospitable proposal with you. And in order to do that, I need to make one last evaluative comment. And that is that all these proposals that I mentioned to you are Darwinian, but ultimately non-embodied in their approach. The genetic approaches all assume that the kinds of behaviors genes pitch us toward are behaviors which maximize the exchange ratio of resources given, received to resources given. That there's a tilt in the symmetry of resource exchange. And here's the assumption. The assumption is that if I get more than I give, that will seamlessly translate into fitness. Now, the interesting thing there is that what it's overlooking is the organism itself. Organisms, in fact, are entities that process resources, inputs and outputs with greater levels or lesser levels of efficiency. And it could be, let's just raise a question, could it be that certain strategies, could it even be that a generous strategy resulted in organismal processing that was more efficient than a tight-fisted strategy? By the way, there are examples of this kind of issue in other domains of biology. One of my other areas of work is in physiological ecology. It's simply not the case that the plants that get the most water and lose the least water are always the plants that flourish the best. If you're looking at water relations in plants, a number of other factors are important, including the internal efficiency of utilizing, of water utilization. So what these genetic approaches are, they're essentially econometric approaches that treat the organism as a passive budget sheet. And at the end of the day, you add up how much have I given, how much have I received, and the person who has the greatest, the most beneficial ratio wins. That may not be the case. Are you with me? And secondly, well, mimetic approaches overlook the organism altogether. So what we want to ask here is there something at the embodied organismal level that can enable us to think through these questions? I need to introduce you to a couple of heuristic tools then. First of all is the notion of biotic internalization. This is just taking embodiment or the organism seriously. One of the things that the philosopher of biology, Hans Jonas, says is the marvelous thing of life is that it is forever about the process of making means ends by internalizing those means. So what he means by that is there may be all sorts of instrumental means. Somebody has to live in a pond of the right temperature in order to do the right thing. But then temperature regulation itself can become internalized. And now there is an intra-organismal end. There's actually, in fact, our first speaker talked about cybernetic systems that had teleonomic set points. So organisms can internalize things and make them ends. It happens with temperature regulation. It happens with parenting, by the way. There's one marvelous paper I'd recommend, one of the most elegant papers in the natural sciences by evolutionary psychologists John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, not on the evolution of altruism, but on the evolution of friendship. And they argue that there are certain kinds of relationships that have been sufficiently internalized in human beings that the relationship itself becomes an internal need. So by the way, that's the bottom line underneath this jargon of what I mean by internalization, is that something that at one point might have been an instrumental end to flourishing actually becomes an internal, interiorized need of the organism itself. I have a marvelous paper on how friendship itself reflects this. So first of all, the notion of biotic internalization. And then secondly, I just need to return you to the notion of game theory, which we began with, which is simply a record of what strategies pay off, although there can be internal payoffs as well. And so we mentioned in Prisoner's Dilemma, a one-shot Prisoner's Dilemma, we don't actually have a solution for that. You meet one person one time, the Nash equilibrium is mutual defection. But in an iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, where you play a number of times, you may have heard of this, but years ago, Robert Axelrod did a contest where he had people submit strategies by computer program to see which strategy won. Always defect or defect after a certain number of defections on your partner. Very simple strategy worked called tit for tat. I do what you do. I open with cooperation, and after that it's tit for tat. That was the dominant strategy. It's not quite altruism yet, but it doesn't stop there. What the Martin Novak, who actually for a while had the same position at Princeton that John Nash had, if you've seen the movie Beautiful Mind, who's now moved to Harvard and is head of their program for evolutionary dynamics, has run a model on tit for tat, and he just introduced one variable into it. He said, what if there's imperfect communication between organisms? If tit for tat, yes, but what if I misunderstand what you did or meant to do? Or sometimes there's imperfect behavior. What if you meant to do something but didn't do it? In other words, he introduced slight variance. And he asked the question, and then what if you're slightly forgiving in response to that variance? And what he found was that tit for tat establishes itself fairly quickly, but then in response to errors of communication, what actually ends up becoming the dominant strategy is generous tit for tat. I will open with cooperation. If you defect once, I'll let it slide and I'll still cooperate. And what that does is changes the other participants' behavior. Generous tit for tat became the dominant strategy. Then he ran this, and as he ran it more and more, there was greater generosity, progressively more generosity in response to more errors. And what he ultimately found, then super generous tit for tat was the dominant strategy. Ultimately, everybody evolved to unconditional cooperation. I'll cooperate no matter what you did. That's pretty good news. Problem is, once you have a community of unconditional cooperators, remember there's variance here. There's always slight variability in it's extremely vulnerable to intrusion by wholesale defection. And of course, in the context of wholesale defection, you need to return to a prudent strategy, and tit for tat became dominant. So there's this cycle. By the way, I think this theoretical model predicts very often the cycle of communities, including, by the way, the cycle of religious revivalism and great relinquishment of resources in religious communities. May even predict the cycle of relationships, falling in love, wholesale abandonment, unconditional commitment, and then, well, it can go many places from there. Now the question is there any way to break out of this cycle? And first step is yes. A number of people have suggested that what you need to do is, you need to control this stage right here, and you need a mechanism of social control. And the way you can effect social control is by either reputational consequences, you just don't cooperate with somebody who has a bad reputation, or actually punitively engaging the person, the defector. And maybe even at cost to yourself. That's called altruistic punishment. If you'll actually punish somebody at cost to yourself, now in theory, that's a tremendous constraint on social defection. Does it ever happen? There's a fascinating paper published in Nature a while back by Ernst Fehr, who's an experimental game theorist, and he actually found that people do punish altruistically, and it's tremendously effective. With punishment, the level of cooperation is very high. Without it, it drops. You start without it, and it's low, and it continues to get lower and lower in a group cooperation game. If you allow people to punish, cooperation goes up and up. Again, they punish altruistically. By that I mean at cost to themselves, and they did a follow-up study. And he found, well, first of all, he gave people questionnaires after. They enjoyed punishing. It wasn't a sadistic impulse to injure the other. It was out of a commitment to fairness. And there was some internal satisfaction to investing in fairness of the group. And Warren knows more about this than I did, but he actually did brain scans, and the reward region of the brain lit up. And I don't have this slide, but it actually lit up in proportion to the amount of punishment that they exercised. Yes, I don't know. And the amount of punishment was proportional to the degree of defection. Now, the really interesting thing is, I'm not going to describe this experiment, but a very analogous phenomenon exists in other primates as well. So what we have is punishment affecting social control, but there are some unresolved questions. First of all, there's just an empirical anomaly. We know that a lot of the most radical cooperation and altruism exists in the complete absence of punishment. In fact, it even exists where the altruistic act is itself highly punishable. And I'm thinking again of Holocaust rescuers here. So the rescuers in the Holocaust didn't do it because they were going to get punished or excluded or ostracized or bad reputations if they didn't. Quite to the contrary, if they were ever found out that they were helping, all those negative consequences would happen. So this is an important idea, but there are some real empirical problems. Lots of people help where they get punished for helping. And secondly, there's the problem of, well, you can punish free riders or defectors, but there's the problem of secondary free riders. And so what's a secondary free rider? That's somebody who doesn't punish when they're supposed to punish. Are you with me? So you got these secondary defectors who don't punish. It looks like there's just a regress. How could you solve that? Well, Dominic Johnson, a game theorist at Princeton, has suggested that this is a role for religion. You have the cognitive internalization of cosmic sanctions. Nearly every religion has such an idea. It could be heaven or hell, be God-ordained punishments or rewards in this life. It could be the idea of karma. And Dominic Johnson points out that this does two things. First of all, because it's internalized, nobody else has to pay the cost of punishment. It's internalized. So there's no issue of secondary defectors. And secondly, if it's internalized, it's highly effective. It looks something like this. Here's the payoff matrix. Well, if you defect while your partner cooperates, you're going to hell. I'm being a little facetious here, but these are Dominic Johnson's ideas, so he can take the heat. And it turns out that the Nash equilibrium is cooperation. Now, you can nuance this for your theology if you want. If you're an Anglican or a Catholic, you might believe, well, if you cooperate with those who cooperate with you, what credit is that to you? Even tax collectors do that. You'll go to purgatory. If you want heaven and sainthood, you have to cooperate with those who defect. On the other hand, if you come from a more mean-spirited tradition, well, but there's a problem with this. You have the problem of tertiary defectors. That is to say, people who don't believe. I mean, why would everybody necessarily believe in this? And by the way, I've challenged Dominic on this. He is thoroughly committed that he can advance this as a traditional Darwinian paradigm under individual selection. And I think the only way to get this, and I think it's reasonable, is by group selection. But in any event, you can have unbelievers. So what do? Well, the solution to that is to detect unbelievers, to have some rite of passage or or costly behavioral display. The anthropologist William Irons has an entire theory of costly religious practices having evolved as demonstrations of genuine commitment. And they're perhaps from circumcision on. Most religious communities, baptism, circumcision, there's a whole range of costlinesses. I find this really interesting, but the anthropologist Richard Sosis has actually examined the longevity of communitarian, that is propertyless communities, secular and religious. It's a dramatic difference. The majority of them exponentially decay within the first decade or two of secular. Religious communities last much longer. And you might think, well, it's just because they had shared beliefs and commitments. That might be. But then he did a follow-up study and actually looked at longevity as a function of the number of costly requirements. And how he quantified that I'm not going to get into. But the more costly requirements, the longer the communities lasted. Virtually no secular communities were in the longer lasting group. So there's some empirical evidence to see. This, by the way, remember the distinction, this doesn't explain actually the ultimate origin of religion, but it might explain some current social utilities of religion. But there's a problem. Quaternary defectors. You could have people, we would just call them hypocrites. You could have people who don't believe, who very self-consciously calculate what it'll cost them to get inclusion into the community. Now, actually, I don't know about in Europe and the UK, but in the United States, actually, there's pretty good reason for believing that many people running for political office do precisely this. They go to church because they calculate that that's necessary if they want to get elected to high office, and there's no particular, and they even choose the policies they're going to affirm based on, oftentimes, appeal to a particular constituency. So the problem is quaternary defectors, people who profess and maybe even do the behaviors, but only to the extent that they pay off. How could you guard against that? Well, you could have our old friend, hard to fake signals, in this case, religious affect. There's some emergent theories of religious experience, and in particular, religious experiences with visible manifestations, like, for example, charismatic manifestations that are extremely hard to fake. They're ecstatic and autonomic. And interestingly enough, at least in the Christian tradition, the history of religious revivalism and the expansion of religious communities across ethnic and social barriers has often been attended by this, all the way back to the history of the first century church when it expanded from largely Jewish to Hellenistic believers, and the original apostles come back and they say, well, they spoke in tongues where the Spirit fell on them just like it fell on us. Who were we to deny them? So that's one possibility. And I don't want to, I'm a little self-conscious about frustrating you with this infinite regress of defection, but both theoretically and empirically, it really is possible. There is really one last kind of defection. You could get a quinquenary defector. A quinquenary defector would be somebody who had the experience and sincerely but inauthentically believed they believed. In the New Testament, again, there's this very sobering passage where Jesus talks about the Pharisee and the publican praying. The Pharisee says, I thank you, Lord, that you have not made me like this other man. And Jesus says, very sobering passage, he says, the Pharisee prayed thus to himself. Now, apparently the prayer was sincere, but unbeknownst to himself, it was disengaged from the transcendent reality that he claimed to be engaging. And we would just call this religious sentimentality or self-deception. Now, what's the solution to this? Well, the solution is authentic intersubjective commitment. The fascinating thing is the person who coined this term, intersubjective commitment, is an evolutionary biologist at the University of Michigan named Randy Nesse. He has no religious commitment, but he's extremely interested in the role of intersubjective commitment in human communities and the way that it might have evolved. And what he means by that is just exactly what it says. That from a place deep in my being, it's not an idea, it's not a costly practice, it's not an emotion, although it may entail all of those things, but it's a genuine internalized commitment to the welfare of another person. And if it's genuine and internalized, it integrates all of these things, ideas plus feelings plus practice. That's what we would call caritas, by the way. Jonathan Edwards' wonderful assessment of the religious affections says that the authentic religious affections occur when all of these things happen. And when they do happen, there's this. Presumably, there's internalized benefits. Life works better if you're living in accord with these commitments. But there are also unbearable costs, internalized costs for defecting, where you really are punished internally. Now, that's a nice idea. Is there any data to suggest there's any reality to all this? And there actually are. Now, Warren, don't ask me any questions about this, but this is brain scan activities of people who were punished by social exclusion. And the pain centers of the brain are activated. There's authentic pain. And not only is there authentic pain, but The primatologist and neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky at Stanford has done a number of studies, not in humans, although this would be very interesting follow-up, but a number of primate species, and he's looked at socially excluded individuals. He's found, first of all, the incidence of heart disease is higher, the integrity of immunological function is lower, and the life expectancy is lower. There's genuine penalty, and those who are successfully assembled into a cooperative matrix have the opposite effects. It's a really interesting study that actually looked at what's happening neurologically, looked at levels of oxytocin in situations of social cohesion and ostracization. And there's actually oxytocin released, which has a number of beneficent effects on immunological function. More recently, Ernst Fehr, I mentioned him before, gave people an aerosol spray of oxytocin, which he administered nasally, and found that it actually changed the dynamics of trust games. Well, lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, this is work by Randy Nesse. It's in press, not published yet, but we've known for a long time that people with terminal diseases, if they're involved in support groups, actually live longer. The mortality rate is lower. And we've assumed, oh yeah, that's what it's about. It's about getting support. Nesse went back and got, and his student Stephanie Brown went back and got a lot of data, did a sequential multivariate analysis to ask whether you're giving or receiving help primarily in the support group. And if you're giving it, or if you're receiving it, are you receiving it because you really can't? Perhaps you're so physiologically impaired that you can't give help, or when controlling for entering level progression of the disease, are you just dependent? And the bottom line is he found statistically significant that the givers had a dramatic, it was actually the givers who had the decreased mortality rates. And the dependents had increased mortality rates. In some sense, it really is more blessed, at least in this study, more blessed to give than to receive. And it appears that there are evidence for the genuine internalization of the benefits of giving. So to conclude this portion, am I suggesting a neo-romanticism that in contrast to Tennyson, love really is creation's final law? Well, in one sense I am. I do think that there are empirically verifiable aspects of the notion that love is connected to organismal flourishing. It really is more blessed to give than to receive. But on the other hand, I'm not. It's not quite that complicated. For genuine love, there's a cost to it. There's this interesting paradox here. And by the way, in the biblical tradition, Christ says, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friend. So there is this paradox that he who clings to his life will lose it, he who loses it will gain it, but the losing it isn't metaphorical. The cost is real. The world is complicated. And in fact, by the way, one of the reasons that this may offer some options for theodicy here, but one of the reasons, possible theological ways in which pain and cost get redeemed, is that we have the opportunity to love others at cost or pain to ourselves. So in the Old Testament tradition, for those of you familiar with it, you may remember this story. If you don't, but there's this story where David wants to offer a sacrifice, and one of his friends says, use one of my animals. And he says, no, far be it from me, for I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing. So one of the complexities of embodiment is that while it may be more blessed to receive, the blessing comes at the cost, oftentimes, of genuine pain. And then lastly, I would say that this notion is a teleological principle, but it's not an operational universal. As we were talking about earlier, not everyone on the earth, not every animal, not every species, not even us at all times of life conform to this. So it may be an eschatological promise. and it may be something to which our lives are pitched, but there is always the option for tragedy. We may miss that destiny, and at any given moment, there's lots of ambiguity in the world. And for this section, I want to quote. I began with Kierkegaard. I want to quote, end with him. He says that hypocrisy, artifice, wiliness, and seduction stretch unconditionally as far as love does, and they can imitate true love so strikingly that there's no absolute criterion, because in every expression of truth or of love, of true love, there exists the possibility of deception, which corresponds to it exactly. Yet to cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It's an eternal loss for which there is no reparation. So let's not be conned. The natural world isn't so simple that love easily abounds. But Kierkegaard says, let's avoid the ultimate con of thinking that in the context of that ambiguity, there's no such thing as genuine love. Okay, so I've given you a little model, a little appetizer for religion. Can we broaden that? Oops. And describe a little bit more comprehensively. Oops. Evolutionary theories of religion. I want to begin with a quote from Pascal, actually. Man is neither angel nor brute, and the unfortunate thing is he who would act the angel acts the brute. It's a wonderful exhortation, actually. We're embodied, but we're not embodied in precisely the same way that animal creatures are. And then he warns us. He says that if we try too glibly to disregard our embodiment and act transcendently, we are probably the most vulnerable to not acting transcendently. We have to understand what it means to be embodied if we're going to act transcendently. I'd say it would be a decoding of this pensée of Pascal's. So I'm going to make some very quick general comments and then spend a few minutes on evolutionary accounts of religion and conclude by discussing ways in which evolutionary accounts are presently being asserted as religion. So my general comments would just be about the notion of natural explanations to begin with. There's a famous article in Natural Theology about 300 years ago by the Queen's physician that argues on the basis, he was the first person actually to observe that not only were the sexes in adult humans in relatively the same proportion, but there was differential mortality in males, but males were born with slightly higher rates. And he argued from this that this was evidence of the divine design for monogamy. It was an exercise in natural theology. And then just about exactly 200 years later, another Brit, R.A. Fisher, proposed an evolutionary explanation for that. And he said that, well, really, when you think about it, whatever the ratio between males and females in a population is, each individual has two parents, one male and one female, and therefore the average fitness of males and females is the same. And therefore, if any parent has more males, the average fitness of males is going to decline. And there's a natural male to female regulating mechanism. By the way, this particular example is widely cited as the way in which science has falsified natural theology. And the first comment I would make is that natural or functional explanations don't in any way have to invalidate providential inferences. It could be, that, in fact, that monogamy is the divinely mandated preference for human beings, and that there's a natural mechanism in place for regulating sexes. Multi-level explanations don't have any intrinsic religious incompatibility. So I want to kind of diffuse that worry up front. But that's almost a cliche, and it overlooks a problem. And the problem is there are two different ways in which we could propose multi-level explanations. One way I would call concordant, where there's a causal explanation and then a different kind of explanation, an interpretive explanation. So in this case, R.A. Fisher's explanation of sex ratios works whether or not there is a God. It's a causal explanation that stands independent of God himself, but the interpretive explanation is not how it's caused, but what it means. But there's another kind of interactive, multi-level explanation, and that I would call an interactive explanation, where there are co-requisite causal inputs, where there are actually multiple causes, and you need all the causes to explain the phenomenon. Now, I want to close this section with an example that is given often by John Hott, and I think he's taken it from John Polkinghorne. And he says somebody's sipping a cup of tea, and you might say, well, why does that tea exist? And one explanation is, well, because of the physics of boiling molecules. It was in a teapot, and the diffusion of soluble substances from the tea leaves into the universal solvent water. That's one explanation. Another kind of explanation is, well, because he wanted tea, and he turned on the stove and put the tea kettle on the stove. The reason I'm citing this example is I think, on the one hand, it's a neat example, but it's actually question-begging. And here's why it's question-begging. That example doesn't tell us which kind of multi-explanation we're giving, and here's why. What it doesn't tell us is whether the same molecular constraints which explain the action of water when boiled and dissolving of the solutes in tea into the solvent water, whether those same molecular principles explain the fact that I want tea, whether we can explain the fact of my wanting tea in my brain at a molecular level in the same way as I can explain the tea itself. And that's the tough question. The tough question, if that is the case, then my wanting tea is just a heuristic or interpretive explanatory move, but there's no actual causal power in my wanting tea. And there are this tension over whether, especially when it comes to religious belief and experience, this tension animates a lot of potential problems between religious belief and scientific explanations of those beliefs. Does God just become, excuse me, I've got a cramp. It's okay. Okay. And it turns out you can get conflicts in both ways. You can get conflicts between causal and interpretive accounts. One wouldn't think, who cares? If we have a causal account, who cares what somebody's interpretation is? But Richard Dawkins, for example, in this wonderful passage, it's wonderful just because it's such a great illustration of this. Dawkins argues strongly that the only kind of accounts that are allowable are actual causal accounts. And interpretive accounts in terms of purposes or first causes not only aren't necessary, but they aren't allowable. And he gives this example. He says, certain questions are simply inappropriate to ask. We may ask the temperature or the color of many things, but, and these are his exact words, you may not ask the temperature or the color of, for example, jealousy or prayer. Similarly, we may ask the purpose of a bicycle, but we may not ask the purpose of a mountain, of an accident, or of the universe. Now, the interesting thing about that, apart from the presumption of telling somebody else what questions they can ask, is that it's really astonishingly brittle and literalistic. In fact, his very example in terms of the color of jealousy or the temperature of prayer, human language, at least the English language, is you can speak of somebody being green with jealousy and lukewarm in prayer, and those are not meaningless statements. Those get at realities that are not scientifically quantifiable, perhaps, but are existentially meaningful. So anyways, that's one tension between causal and interpretive explanations, when some traditions don't allow the former. But of course, the other tension is between actually differing causal accounts, secondary versus primary causes. And theological traditions have fought this battle on many fronts with scientific explanation, where a supernatural or what theologians call a first cause is felt to be necessary for some aspect of the natural world. It hasn't always been the case. But in the case of religious belief and experience, or in some traditions, the religious revelation or of transmission of scriptural traditions, or miracles, for example, it may be that certain objects of religious belief, it may be important to preserve the notion of primary causation. Now that turns out, I know Phil Clayton's going to be talking with you at great depth, so I'm not going to say much more about that. Those concepts themselves are a little fuzzy, but they turn out to be really significant and potentially problematic in explanations of religious belief and experience. Now, I do want to say one last thing. When we talk about an explanation of religion, there's lots of presumption there. First of all, what is religion? But secondly, what aspects of religion are we trying to explain? So there's religious belief, there are religious affections and experience, there are religious practices, and with all those things, there are the capacities for those things, and then there are the specific instantiations of those capacities. So we might be talking about the origin of the capacity for religious cognition, or particular religious beliefs, or the capacity for religious experience and affection, or particular religious experiences, or religious practices. And for each of these, we have a number of approaches. All of these approaches, I'm going to say just a few sentences about each, but all of them are natural or secondary, and there's always the possibility of divine or primary causation. And I've also lied to you a little bit, because I've suggested that an evolutionary explanation just involves the origin. But in fact, evolutionary explanations are not just about the origin, they're also about the maintenance of particular phenotypes or structures. Stephen Jay Gould, in his kind of magnum opus before he died, says a crucial but often disregarded distinction between reasons for historical origin and basis for current utility. The common conflation of these entirely separate notions has engendered enormous confusion in evolutionary theory. So you've got the origin and the maintenance. We have a 5 by 5 by 2 potential explanatory matrix. Now, some of you may have seen reviews of a number of widely discussed books. One of them, humbly entitled by Pascal Boyer, called Religion Explained. Well, it turns out that Boyer's proposal is just a proposal for the origin of particular religious or supernatural beliefs. It's not an explanation of religion. David Sloan Wilson's book, Darwin's Cathedral, is actually a proposal for the maintenance of particular religious practices. And then Dan Dennett's recent book, Breaking the Spell, well, it actually surveys a number of approaches, but it comes down on the mimetic maintenance of particular religious beliefs. So I'll say from the start, we really don't have a comprehensive explanation, and I think it's unrealistic to expect a comprehensive explanation of religion. Okay, so three thoughts, three ideas that currently dominate the scene in religious explanation of religion. One is non-adaptationist theories. Religion is not an adaptation. These emerged largely from evolutionary cognitive science. But it's a byproduct or a spandrel of other cognitive processes. In particular, Pascal Boyer, Scott Atran, and actually a religious believer who is at the Center for Cognitive Science at Oxford, Justin Barrett, are all suggesting that there's a relationship between our ability to detect agents, normal agents, and belief in supernatural beings. That we have an agency detection device, and this isn't necessarily a specific location in a brain, but it may be part of our cognitive toolkit. And in addition to that agency detection device, developmentally, there is a certain robustness to agent concepts. And we know from a variety of empirical observations, actually, that first of all, our agent detector is a little bit hyperactive. In fact, it's called the hyperactive agency detecting device. That is to say, it generates more false positives than it does false negatives. Secondly, there's an innate tendency to magnify agent qualities very early in life, regardless of religious upbringing. There's the capacity to attribute immortality or great survivability, immense potency, and immense knowledge to agents, not just divine agents, but cats, dogs, and even trees. That seems to decline over the course of life, but it doesn't decline in God concepts. And lastly, teleological inferences inevitably tend to promote agent attribution. And I want to acknowledge Justin Barrett for his help in personal conversations and in these specific points. So here are a couple of experimental things to think about. Take-home experiences, how this works. Are computers social beings with minds? Well, we all know rationally they're not, but a number of experiments indicate that adults treat them as having feelings, personalities we like or dislike, gender. We just changed the voice on our voicemail system at Westmont College. It's a computer-generated voice, but I liked the woman before. I don't like this person at all. It's kind of rude. He is rude. Are dots intentional beings? So this is really interesting, but infants appear to process chasing dots. If you can't see the different colors here, but if you just draw dots on a computer screen with vortices in back of them, they can discriminate between chases and matched random movement, and by 9 months old, they can tell when the chaser becomes the chasee. Later in life, adults describe these events by attributing beliefs, desires, and sometimes even gender to these objects. That's part of the rationale of video games, by the way. In the earliest video games, I was completely addicted to one called Pac-Man, and even an earlier one called Pog. It was just a round circle that moved across the screen. Now, of course, rationally, we have the capacity to evaluate agent detection, but the detections themselves appear to be pretty innate. And I'm going to skip that. And there are aspects of these agents. Here, the children were asked if different agents could tell what was in a closed box. And when they were 3 years old, pretty much everyone could. Trees, snakes, elephants, bears, mother, and God. By the time that they were 6, only God could tell what was in a closed box. All the other agents couldn't tell. Same thing with super perceptions. The axis of this graph is flipped, but everybody could see in the dark at 3 years old. By 6 years old, kitty cats, and God can see in the dark. Fascinating experiments with immortality, by the way. 3, 4, and many 5-year-olds believe that even after snakes eat mice, the mice are still alive. After rats eat food, the food isn't there anymore, but the mouse is still there. And by the way, this is independent of religious upbringing, instruction about souls or heaven or hell. So there's some evidence that these have been conducted in many different cultures. So the bottom line is that the spandrel theory, evolutionary cognitive science, says that there are innate cognitive predispositions to infer agency, and the notions of agency are very hospitable to magnified agent powers. Now, what would we want to say about this? Well, first of all, I would say that distinguishing or identifying these things as byproducts is actually a very tricky judgment. We can identify them as existing, but to call them a byproduct somehow means to say that the system wasn't designed to do that to begin with. That's not clear at all. Secondly, to call the agent detector itself hyperactive assumes that there are more false positives than there are false negatives. Now, certainly it's not perfect. No perception device is perfect, so there's imprecision in all perceptual apparatus. But to assume that it's hyperactive actually assumes the consequent. That is to say, the people making that judgment assume it's hyperactive because they're already sure that there is no such thing as life after death or supernatural agents. So it's actually not clear whether the agency detectors are hyperactive or whether they're actually responding to something that is there. And lastly, and this is the most serious scientific problem, these theories actually do propose a cognitive mechanism for our cognitive hospitability to a number of agents, many of which most of us would believe aren't there. But there's nothing about them that distinguish the innate religiosity of some concepts. For example, what's the difference between God and Mickey Mouse or tooth fairies? And the difference between God, and this would get back to a definition of religion, which I would assert, but which Boyer wouldn't. Boyer just believes religion is belief in a non-natural agent. Somebody like Peter Berger or Thomas Luckman, sociologists of religion, would say that religion is belief in a sacred and transcendent order to reality by which we interpret the world and through which we organize our own lives. And Mickey Mouse and tooth fairies don't do that for us. God does, or even non-theistic religions do. And Boyer and the whole cognitive science tradition completely fails to engage this, I would argue, most crucial aspect of religious life. So there's one tradition, but we might, in terms of religious implications, well, first of all, it assumes it's a pathology. That's not necessarily the case. Could it be, though, that if the agent detector were hyperactive, that would give us grounds for thinking that religious beliefs were unreliable? Some people are making that argument. That's an interesting theological and philosophical question. And I would argue no, for two reasons. First of all, there are lots of instruments which err on the side of false positives, which nevertheless do give us real information about the world. But secondly, religious attributions, and this is a point that Justin Barrett makes, are not just nakedly located in agent attribution. There's a rich tradition in terms of personal development and in terms of cultural reflection by which people evaluate the plausibility and the meaning of various agent attributions. We call it theology, by the way. And so we're forever evaluating the plausibility of agent attributions, and many of them are rejected. So the fact that an agent attributor might be hyperactive doesn't in and of itself grant warrant for disbelieving religious concepts. In fact, I would suggest it opens up options for natural theology to suggest that certain modes of perception or religious cognition are innate. There may be certain things, and Justin Barrett argues actually that atheism is learned, but that some sort of religious sensibility or response to the world is innate. It doesn't mean that all religions are equivalent or that the claims are redundant, but it does mean, and advocates of this position would strongly agree with this, that there is innate, and that we're uncovering innate cognitive mechanisms for religious response to the world. Now, I'm going to use that as a kind of a case study of one of the three major evolutionary theories of religion. You've seen multi-level selection. The other one is mimetics, actually. So I'm not going to say much about those. But I do want to say about mimetic theory. Interesting thing about mimetic theory, and Dennett argues this in his recent book. Richard Dawkins himself argues that religion is a meme, but it's specifically a mimetic pathogen. Dawkins says that religion is a virus, more dangerous than the smallpox virus, but more difficult to eradicate. And what we might, there's actually an empirical question there. We could ask, which he doesn't ask at all. There's a psychological and historical question about what the actual influence has been of religious belief on individuals and on human cultures. I'd suggest that that's going to end up being a complicated question depending on the nature of religious commitment and the nature of religions, but it's not clear to me at all that Dawkins is right here. And in addition to being an empirical question, it's also a metaphysical question. If one wants to assert that religion has a pathological influence or is itself a pathogen, that assumes, reflects certain assumptions about what right functioning of humanity are. What pathogens are, ultimately, is something that causes us to deviate from our own set points or organismic telos. And so if in fact, by the way, one believes, as the Westminster Confession suggests, that this is the end of man, to love God and to enjoy him forever, then religion surely isn't a pathogen. If you believe that that has nothing to do with the human telos or human flourishing, then perhaps it is. So I would say that this comment actually is, again, assuming the consequent. It follows directly from the metaphysical commitments of its advocate, because he starts with the commitment that religion is false. Then anybody who believes otherwise has to have chosen or been infected by a wrong belief. Okay, I want to conclude with some comments about, turn this around for a moment and talk about how evolutionary theory itself is beginning to function as a religion, actually. And there are 4 ways, and they're developmental ways in which it does this. First of all, there's a long legacy, by long I mean a generation old now, of asserting moral and religious fictionalism by advocates of evolutionary theory. It turns out, secondly, in building upon that, there's a tradition of evolutionary scientism. Thirdly, and specifically with respect to Darwinism, there's this assertion that Darwinism is universal and explains all human problems. And lastly, and most recently, there's actually, on a number of theoreticians, there's the very explicit attempt to make evolution the culturally unifying, meaning-making myth of the age. With respect to religious and moral fictionalism, it comes in 2 shapes, actually. Religious falsity usually is a starting point. I haven't seen actually any arguments by evolutionary biologists of why evolution entails the falsity of religious beliefs. But moral anti-realism, there actually is a tradition in the philosophical literature by evolutionary philosophers of arguing from evolution that moral reality is a fiction. In fact, Michael Ruse, in a fascinating article, I referred to it earlier in Zygon a few years back, says that Darwinism implies a relativity about moral reality that is at odds with the Christian faith, and, quote unquote, therefore, those who are worried about the conflict between science and religion have good grounds for their worries. And we can talk in the question session about what his argument is, but I'm just going to say that he makes it. What do I mean by evolutionary scientism? Well, several things. It begins with an objectivist epistemology. Now there's some jargon there, but I'll give you an example. When I started reading sociobiology, this was 30 years ago, E.O. Wilson begins that book by saying, imagine space aliens circling the Earth, looking at our human behavior and the behavior of animals. What I want to come up with in my theory would be an explanation of what they would see from an almost extraterrestrial, non-human, impartial, objectivist standpoint. What I was struck by was I had recently read a book from a generation before, Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression. He begins with almost the exact same analogy. Instead of space aliens orbiting the Earth, it's Martians looking at the Earth through a telescope. And so happens that this exact analogy, all the way up until Dennett's recent book, is replicated in virtually every popularization of the application of evolutionary theory to human biology. We're encouraged to believe that what we're presented with is what an otherworldly objectivist observer would come up with this. By the way, first of all, I don't think that's possible. We are humans. We're not extraterrestrials. So it's presumptuous to suggest that. Secondly, I don't even think it's desirable. As humans, we have access to an information pool that extraterrestrials would never have. We actually are what we're studying. But in any case, this highlights the application of evolutionary theory to human behavior all the way back to the inception with Konrad Lorenz, and it's been absolutely persistent over the last 50 years. Secondly, there's an unapologetic materialist metaphysics. The evolutionary biologist Dick Lewontin in the New York Review of Books a few years ago says it's not that the methods of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the world, but on the other hand, we're forced by our prior adherence to material causes to create an apparatus that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive. That materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So that's the prior commitment animating much of this program. Next, there's a reductive ontology. And by that I mean, E.O. Wilson says this beautifully in sociobiology, that this discipline must be pursued to explain ethics and ethical philosophers, if not epistemology and epistemologists at all depths. Get rid of philosophy, get rid of theology, get rid of epistemology. If we understand our evolutionary genetics, we'll understand it all. And 30 years later in Consilience, he hasn't changed his tune. So this isn't some sort of conspiratorial paranoia of what they're really up to. This is the overt proclamation, at least, of what a number of the leading theoreticians have been up to. And that, of course, culminates in the assertion of scientific veracity as the only legitimate access to genuine knowledge. And there's two versions of that. There's the Dawkinsian version, which says religious questions are just ruled out of court. There's one world, and it's science. And there's another world. There's the two worlds version, the Stephen Jay Gould view, his notion of non-overlapping magisteria, or noma. It appears to be a little bit more religiously hospitable. He doesn't want to rule out religious questions. On the other hand, they don't overlap with factual questions, in his view. So science has access to the world of facts. Religious belief actually don't constitute knowledge, in View's view. So it's an equally scientific view, ultimately. Well, I'm going to skip over a fair amount of universal Darwinism, but I do want to mention in a wonderful essay by Richard Dawkins called Universal Darwinism. He invites us, as so many have, to imagine encountering intelligent aliens. And he says there that if we encountered them, they probably would have very little interest in Shakespeare or Mozart, but they would have great interest in Einstein and Darwin. And he says that, therefore, this is a wonderful phrase, Darwinism really matters in the universe. And all questions of life have the same answer, natural selection. I feel a little self-conscious, like I'm proof texting, taking quotes out of context, but I actually am not. This is the commitment of Dawkins and a number of others. I do want to point out that from the very beginning, when he says that aliens will have interest in Einstein but not Shakespeare, there's a very interesting implication of that. While Dawkins is a robust materialist, there's actually a dualistic implication in the following way. His notion of mind and of rationality is sufficiently disembodied that he thinks an intelligent being would only have interest in science and math and wouldn't have interested in the valuational or literate enterprises like music or art. But what we know of how the mind works, work of Antonio Damasio and others, is that rationality is deeply embedded in the organic matrix of emotions and even valuational judgments. If there were, and this is a point that Simon was making earlier today, if there are other intelligent beings in the universe, it's highly likely that their intelligence would be, as far as what we know about how intelligence works, would be concordant with our own. I think it likely that they just might be interested in Shakespeare as much as they are interested in Einstein. This is a great one. So he ends up concluding that certain scientific ideas are, quote unquote, beyond the reach of factual refutation. It is not only right in our time, but will be right in all future times, even if an alternative is universally accepted in some new age of human history. But that sounds like religious, not only faith, but religious fanaticism to me. Right in our time and right in future times, even if those people in the future think that they have disproved it. And to conclude then, this has generated really an epic evolutionary mythology. from Baconian supplements to religion, where the cause is understood, the effect can be produced, to scientific remedies for religion. I mentioned earlier that Dawkins says religion is a virus more pathogenic than the smallpox virus. He goes on to say, but science is the virus detection software. So science is the remedy for religion, but it doesn't stop there. It becomes a salvific replacement for religion. E.O. Wilson says, sainthood, subordinate to the biological imperatives above which it is supposed to rise, is replaced by the true humanization of altruism, which can come only through a deeper scientific examination of morality. Such a great irony here, because at the beginning of his book, he invited us to look at the world as if we were extraterrestrials. And now he is telling us that that view is the only way to become truly human. And then lastly, the evolutionary proclamation as religion. Wilson says that this evolutionary epic is the best myth we will ever have, the only mythology that can manufacture great goals from the sustained pursuit of pure knowledge. So what could we say in conclusion, and I really am concluding? Well, first of all, there's really some provocative evidence that religion is biotically innate and beneficent in terms of organismal flourishing. But I would also say that biological explanations, and I would say this theologically but also scientifically at this point, are necessary. I mean, we are embodied creatures, but they're insufficient. At present, we don't have anything close to a sufficient biological explanation for religion. I doubt we ever will, but the fun of science is in admitting what we don't presently understand. Thirdly, with respect to God and the religious imagination, Voltaire says that if there were no God, we would have to invent him. And he says, we were made in God's image, and we have since returned him the compliment. So that we manufacture God after our own image, but there's a benign and a less than benign interpretation of that. One interpretation of that is that because we really are made in the image of God, the religious imagination, when turning itself outward, imagines the God who is really there. That he has equipped us by endowing us with his nature to imagine him rightly, although always open to being attuned by input from the religious community and possibly by the action of God himself. The less benign interpretation of this is idolatry, where we actually construct a God that is nothing like the true God and worship that. The interesting moment in our current history is that while most idolatries of the past may have in a sense been honest mistakes, where people invented a God they thought was God but wasn't, the current project advancing evolution as religion has no such illusions. A quote that I left out earlier is that morality is a fiction fobbed off on us by our genes, but in order for it to work, we must treat it as if it has a transcendent reality. I can actually two quotes along those lines. What is happening now in the evolution, in some quarters of the evolutionary community, is that the evolutionary myth is being proposed as a supplement or substitute for religion, simply to condescend to or patronize the human need for religion, even though there is the acknowledgement up front that there in fact is no transcendent telos or purpose to the cosmos. So I want to end with the quote that I began with. Man is neither angel nor brute, and the unfortunate thing is he who would act the angel acts the brute. When I began, I said that this was a warning about perhaps inadequately appreciating the constraints of our embodiedness. But it can also be a warning against the presumption of assuming for ourselves the prerogative of inventing a meaning and telos to the cosmos, when in fact that job has already been done by someone else. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much again, Jeff. And we've got some time for questions. And just
two questions. So the first question is kind of question of detail. On the experiment of children who at 3 things think that everybody knows what is in a closed box, and at 5 think only that God does. You said the results are independent of religious upbringing, but at least the concept of God presupposes religious upbringing.
Yeah. Let me clarify that. Actually, there's a series of developmental experiments. So there's one experiment that I actually didn't show a slide for, but it's the immortality experiment that is independent of religious upbringing. So you show a child a mouse eating some pellets, and then you put the mouse and the pellets in a box, and you ask the child when they're 3 years old, what did the mouse do? Ate the pellets. Are the pellets still there? They'll say no. And then you show a child a snake eating a mouse, and you put a snake and a mouse in a box, and you say, what did the snake do? He ate the mouse. Is the snake there? And at 3 years old, is the mouse still there? And at 3 years old, children universally say yes. That they understand that the snake has eaten the mouse, but they don't think that death ends agency. And that is independent of religious upbringing. Now, the God questions are certainly not. They have to have been introduced to the notion of God before. But I would say that at 3 years old, kids routinely ascribe these omnicognizant and omniperceptual powers to all kinds of agents. They think trees know what's in boxes, many of them.
Thank you. Then my second question, if I got you right, you think that scientific explanation of religion is necessary but insufficient. I just would ask on the necessary bit. Why is a scientific explanation of religion necessary? Because if religion is the result of direct divine action, then any scientific explanation of religion will fail. Is this not a genuine possibility?
Yeah, I would say 3 things to that. And actually, this is a slide I skipped over. Even if some religions or some experiences of some people are the result of divine action, there's presumably a lot that isn't. So I think we ought to understand that. We ought to understand as much as we can the dynamics of toxic religions, for example, or of religions that don't even profess belief or access to the supernatural. So that's one comment. There's clearly a multiple ontogeny of religions, and that's true, by the way, even within religious traditions. So they poke fun at one another and say, well, your religion's caused by the devil and mine's caused by God. Or within my own tradition of Christianity, I remember when I was a new Christian, I picked up a book that said, Warren's going to bristle at this, but it says conversion, real and psychological. Well, that kind of gets at your question. Are there pseudo-conversions? So that's one point. Secondly, even if it does involve divine action, it's divine action in the context of embodied reality. And now I'll speak from my own tradition again. As I read the biblical tradition, and I believe that God does act in history, but the key word there is in history. That in some sense, the context of divine action honors or is constrained by embodied reality. So the statement of Jesus about because of your hardness of heart, he allowed you divorce. What on earth does that mean? And could we investigate hardness of heart, for example? Would that be an embodied constraint? So I would say, secondly, even if we believe that God acts, he acts in the context of embodiment. And so there might be all kinds of questions. And this, by the way, isn't new. Students of historical revivals have asked often what cultural environments are more fertile to revival, for example, than others. Students of the spiritual disciplines asks, what disciplines with my body make me more receptive to the divine light. So that would be the second. And then the third would be, I think one of the things that the sciences can do for us is alert us to the pretensions of transcendence when something isn't transcendent. And I'm very sympathetic to your question. That doesn't mean there is no transcendent, but it does allow for the fact that we're often presumptuously led astray by credentialing something as transcendent. I'll betray my own political affinities here. So the president of my country has been unashamed about saying that the war in Iraq was God's will. And then he felt led by God to do that. And I might ask, I doubt that. I don't know if there's a way that science can help us get a handle on that, and this is too long an answer to your question, but I will recommend a fascinating book by one of the people I've already mentioned, Dominic Johnson from Princeton, a game theorist, and he's written a recent book called Overconfidence and War, and it's a game theoretic analysis of the way religion contributes to a biased, a distorted outcome of the likelihood of good things coming from war. There's a scientific treatment of religion that I think could be very helpful.
Okay, so anybody else? Yeah, we have one question here.
I mean, I just want to point, you mentioned when you discussed the Dawkins statement about the religion being a virus, need for experimentation on the role of a religion. I think so that the very big fields where already have been done such experiments. I think so it is in Nazi Germany and the communism country. I mean Russia, I mean China, I mean Cambodia, where you can, when you can see what society which really somehow refuse religion can bring, what effects can be there. I think so. This is probably not really well studied problem in this respect, because I think it is very explicitly spoken that I mean, for example, in Russia, that it was always somehow hoped that one day there will be no religion in Russia at all, and there was a very big attempt to put all these people to jail, to camps, you know. So I think so. This is a very big field to study.
I think it's a wonderful point, and the examples that you mentioned. I'm not sure what you meant. I'm not completely. Did everybody hear his point? Well, you identified my suggestion that whether or not religion is a virus and contributes to or detracts from human flourishing is an empirical question, and then you brought up the regimes in communist China and in Germany and in Russia, in which religious believers have been oppressed and mistreated. I'm not quite sure if you were suggesting that attitude of let's put religion under a microscope and study it contributed to that, or whether it might have prevented that. But I want to argue for the latter. It seems to me that the cultural environments in which people of faith are most severely mistreated are the cultural environments that begin with the assumption that religion is a pathology and never open-mindedly ask the question of what might be the fruit of religious belief, and what kinds of religious belief lead to what kinds of ends. And I will mention actually one very sobering example from the literature that I've just been describing to you. Dan Dennett, in his earlier book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, says that out of political correctness for the preservation of cultural diversity, we probably need to make sure that religions aren't made completely extinct. But the best thing might be to keep around a few representatives of religions in what he calls cultural zoos. And under certain circumstances, so that these beliefs aren't inordinately propagated, it might be necessary to forcefully remove the children from their believing parents. that's a scary proposal. And I have to say personally, as the child of a Holocaust survivor, that's really scary to me. And it's made by a leading evolutionary scholar of these issues. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Did you want to come back to something? We'll just come back and then...
I just want to maybe add that it's not only that the believers were persecuted. Generally, let's say the Nazi and the communists, they thought, I mean, their opinion on religion was exactly the same as Dawkins. So it is just, and were based on humanism and on evolution theory. I mean, they were, I mean, what was to kill the 100,000 people? I mean, nothing. It is just kind of on the way to communism, we can do everything. In Cambodia, they kill 50% of the population. It's not even in Russia or in China. It is 50%, which is maybe the world, I mean, championship. This is something which probably should be studied in this respect. I mean, of the role of religion and what religion. I mean, for example, Christian faith is always accused, or another religion also accused of the wars or something, but probably not to this extent,
Yes.
you know.
Yes, Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize-winning physicists say anybody can be mischievous, but it takes religion to make somebody truly evil. So there is a sense that that religion is not only pathological, but it's uniquely pathological, that the worst atrocities in human history have been conducted under the banner of religion, and that's part of the impetus for the drive to extinguish it. I would want to meet Weinberg halfway. First of all, I don't think it's religion. I think it's ideology more generally. So the Marxist ideology and the Nazi ideology, overtly irreligious, have had their share of human violence as well. But it's also the case, anybody can be kind of nice, but it may take religion to make them truly saintly. That in one sense, it is profound intersubjective commitments to the ultimate purpose of existence that can bring out both the worst but also the best in human beings. And those are the questions I think we need to ask. Under which situations, in which kinds of beliefs, and in what ways are they fostered, and how do they transform human personality? I don't think for a moment we'll ever have a scientific solution, but we may have one piece of the puzzle to help those of us with religious commitments foster our own and encourage others' growth in those commitments.
We'll just complete one more question, I think, over here, and then we're going to have a little break, and then, yeah.
I'd just like to make a comment. If you're studying Russia and atheistic regimes, I'd like to point to South America, which was 100% Catholic, one might say, which is my own affiliation, and was disaster in terms of marginalization and poverty and deprivation. And that would be a religious continent. So I don't think the answer is quite as simple. I think religious and a-religious, there are lots of other factors involved. I mean, it's obviously not true Christianity in South America, but nonetheless, it's the dominant. It has been the dominant religion. Now, Protestant is now up to 10%, I believe, and so on. But predominantly a religious continent with mega poverty, mega marginalization, and lots of death. Then, assuming if not heads chopped off, at least dying from poverty. So it's not that simple, I don't think.
Well, I don't think it's a question of, I certainly wasn't proposing anything was simple here. I mean, yeah. But I would say, I'm not even clear why I do what I do from day to day. The question of the causality between behind personal agency is very complicated. The question of causality in historical trajectory is immensely difficult. So I do want to say that, but I also want to say, and maybe this would be a good place to close, several people have brought up what do we mean by religion, and I have suggested, at least as a starting point, Thomas Luckman's notion of a sacred canopy or belief in a sacred order to reality. The interesting thing is that even with that, and I recommend this book by Thomas Luckman and Peter Berger called The Invisible Religion. And in many ways, actually, it's a sociological analog of self-deception theory. What they argue in invisible religion, this relates to your comment, is that many times in cultures, and there's often a trajectory between indigenous cultures where there is no definite distinction between secular and sacred, to more developed cultures where religion is propagated by a priestly class, and actually there are knowledge workers who are entrusted with religious beliefs, and there becomes a distinction between secular and sacred. And finally, what they argue is that in some cultures, what used to be the sacred domain is nominalized. People still nominalized, not in the sense of half-hearted commitment, but in the literal sense of nominal, that it is just used to name or identify the particular community. I'm this, I'm a Catholic. So it functions, and they call this nominal religion, that it has a social function of community identification. But what really orders human action and the lens through which events are interpreted, there's another entirely different and unrecognized sacred domain, which they call the invisible religion. So this becomes extremely complicated when we want to explain not only historical outcomes, but if we want a scientific explanation of religion, which religion is it that we're trying to explain? The professed or nominal religion? Or, and in this sense, probably everyone is a believer. The worldview, which constitutes the ordering matrix of personal agency. And oftentimes those are conflated, obscured, or altogether unrecognized.
Good. Well, I think that's a good point in which to. We're going to do the same as we did last night. But first of all, we really want to thank Jeff very much indeed. We worked him hard again this afternoon, and so